Right. Let's start. So we have a couple of items on the agenda. The first item is about contract for JSON coding and decoding. Olena, do you want to walk us through the design document of the issue?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can I share my screen? Okay,
Yes.
thanks. Yes, so I want to describe the problem we faced recently. So Magento 2.2 changed the default serialization implementation in favor of JSON because there was some security vulnerabilities discovered in the PHP unserialized function. So it was changed in order to cover serialization needs, but not all other use cases where JSON can be used. So what I mean, this is how JSON serializer interface looks right now. It has serialize and unserialize and accepts data and string, but the native PHP JSON encode and decode has also additional arguments, options, and depth. So as you can understand from this design, we cannot fully replace native JSON encode and decode with this interface and its default implementation. There are different solutions here how we can change it. For example, introduce new JSON encoder interface, and it will have the same behavior as the native PHP functions. Or, for example, we can just extend existing one, or we can add virtual types and inject options in the constructor. But here is the main point we need to decide: do we really want to introduce this abstraction layer, or we would recommend using just native PHP functions instead of it? The main objective why we need, the main point why we need abstraction layer here, it's because PHP code is like third-party code we cannot control, and we want to protect our system from possible vulnerabilities, for example, like it was before with unserialized. So that's why this new implementation could help us to resolve such issue. On other important point, that by default, to get the last JSON error, we need to call additional function to get this error, even if in 7.3 it was fixed that JSON can throw an exception, but still the default behavior remains the same. It just returns false. And that's not what we expected, because we expect to have proper implementation with throwing an exception in case if something went wrong. So my proposal is to introduce new JSON serializing interface, but I want to, I know that Vinay is here and he has absolutely different attitude to this problem, and his suggestion is to recommend using JSON encode and JSON decode. I mean native PHP functions. Does anyone has something to say in addition to that?
In summary, do we remove the serializer interface and use native functions, or do we introduce new interface because the current one is does not offer all flexibility, right?
Not exactly. So the main idea currently that we have the serialization mechanism, and we have two implementation, whether it's going to be PHP native serialization or JSON encoding and decoding. And currently we don't differentiate these two processes, like JSON decoding and the serialization. So the idea was to introduce two different APIs for either serialization. If your business logic actually doesn't depend on the particular implementation of the decoder JSON encoding or PHP serialization, or for example, if your system is null for sure, and this is a desirable state to work with the JSON, so it's supposed to depend on another extension point, JSON decode API.
But what's okay? So do we have any other reasons why to keep abstraction and why not use native PHP functions? So is it true? Or Vinay was.
Yes. Well, first, Elena, just small correction here. I totally get the point of wanting to protect Magento core against bugs in PHP function implementation, like with an old serialized function. So wrapping JSON encode and decode does make sense from that point of view. And but I think introducing a new interface is it's quite a complex solution there. Not really just a lot of work, a lot of backward compatibility issues. It would be nicer to just add the option argument to the existing JSON implementation and keep it, and that solves the problem nicely. And then, but for third-party code, I believe it's generally good to decouple from Magento framework as much as possible. So then that's why I said, okay, for my own code, or for if third-party developers use it, I think it's fine if they use JSON encode decode directly. Like I don't really see any benefit or I see benefit, but I think the benefits versus the drawbacks of using the Magento wrapper class just to do JSON encoding decoding. For me, the coupling is worse than using, the risk of having a bug in JSON encode decode in the PHP implementation. So my solution, suggestion, not solution, is your solution, sorry. Your solution, your alternative implementation, your first suggestion there, that just adds the optional options argument to the JSON implementation of the serializer interface is fine for me. But I don't like the idea of having a JSON encoder interface or virtual types because of complexity involved.
Yeah, I also like option about adding optional argument. I think using this interface, the main reason for me is that it's easier because if you don't have the interface, you will always have to write the same boilerplate code to check if you were able to JSON decode correctly. You will always have to check for errors.
So just a quick question to you, Vinay. So just to clarify, so what you propose is to make Magento modulus and actually Magento code to rely not on the native JSON encode decode implementation, but on our own abstraction.
On the concrete JSON class.
On the concrete JSON.
No new JSON encoder interface, but a JSON implement serializer interface, right?
Yeah. So, but this means that our concrete JSON class will become an API, and it's supposed to be marked as an API.
I think it already is.
It already is.
It already is.
Okay, let's. I just want to understand for myself. So, what are the reasons that we have this abstraction today? The first reason is that we already had the problem once when we had to go and replace every unserialized with JSON decode, and we are trying to protect against that by having abstraction layer. So in future. And second reason, if I understand correctly, I'm just my current understanding. Second reason is that we have some code, some exception error handling code in that, so it's a convenience thing.
Yeah, but by abstraction you mean interface or wrapper around native PHP function?
I don't care with the wrapper around PHP function.
Okay.
You mean abstraction like serializer interface or like JSON encoder class?
depending on what we recommend to use developers.
We have this serializer interface, and we have multiple implementation for this serialized interface, and it's an issue by itself because this implementation don't really comply with the interface, and it's a separate issue. I don't think we discuss removing of that interface. We probably should remove it, not just have.
The question I have, so minuites. Okay, so it might be useful for core code. For extensions, I don't want to enforce. If we don't enforce for extensions, why? I'm just saying, why do we need the difference between what we propose for the third-party developers and for core? And I'm trying to understand, why do we need that interface at all? Like, why not? Why us? Why don't we want to use JSON and code JSON decode? Because there is some exception handling in that logic.
That's one of the reasons.
But the exception message that I saw there was very Magento level informative. Something went wrong effectively during that serialization.
But at least it will stop the execution and throw the exception. But currently you're supposed to check like the last error to realize whether that was like it's going to be just a false. So you will have the conditional logic, check whether the result is false or not.
Okay, but anyway, in any case, you very often you have to check for many things, right? Like when you serialize something, right?
No, it's slightly different. You need check in library, but not in model. So our suggestion is move all platform or PHP specific code in library, and in model use library. It's possible Magento framework on other framework, but don't use direct PHP native code in the model.
So this is so-called like anti-corruption layer we usually.
Yeah, but I'm trying. Yes, but the point is that anytime. So the problem with having this interface and having this abstraction is again that the Magento developer that works with Magento has to know about it. And very often they will not know about it. They will still use JSON code, JSON decode, but also they have to know, so they have to use it. So there is additional thing. I want to understand if there is true reason to have it. So, and what's the true reason? Because if you have to check that your encoding went well, like you could decode successfully, that's one thing. But my understanding is that anytime you decode something or serialize something, you have to check the value is there, and then only you can do something, continue working with it. So I'm not sure if you can hide that abstraction from people, hide that problem from people.
But you like
definitely
why?
We can.
It's just a little easier to handle. You can just adding try catch block to.
What's the difference between try catch and if? And then check for error from that perspective.
You need to apply multiple functions. You need to know about these functions. You need to know that you need to check for this error.
But in that case, you need to know about the Magento interface. You need to know that it throws exception. You need to know that you have to catch the exception. So the number of things that you need to know, I'm not sure if it's less or more. And again, I don't have strong opinion for one or for other. Just want to make sure that we have good understanding of the reasons why we have that.
Yeah, actually, problem not in that we need check. Actually, problem that we have error in JSON decode and it's never checked in third-party code. So people just don't care about it. And exception help.
So the reason why we want this interface, one of the reasons, is to enforce proper error handling that people very often miss, and that's why they have some weird behavior in their applications, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's not the most important thing here. The most important thing here is that we want to protect the system and the framework from the code we do not control. In this case, this is PHP.
Yes, but And that's also, yes, so that's one of the things why I think we introduced the interface and we have to replace and serialize with JSON. But I think with PHP we rely on it so much that we need some level of trust versus inconvenience that we introduce. So for me, I would like, if that was the only reason, I would vote for not having that abstraction, because okay, so we trust that PHP has backwards compatibility. We trust that PHP with low probability will have problems, and with that probability, we can go and replace all usages one more time. If we estimate that probability is pretty low, right?
Yeah, we trusted the same with serialize and serialize.
Yes, I understand, but that happens fairly rarely, and yes, we have to do and go and replace it. But we estimate. I would vote for estimating the risk as low, and then if it happens next time, we just do the same thing. We go and replace all native functions with new native function, right? So it's better than forcing everybody to know about some interface that we have. I would vote for that, but it sounds like there is more. The other reason, additional reason that's in addition to that is this more correct error handling, right?
Yeah. So this like a little bit of code that you will have to write here, and I think just try catch is easier, and another reason of like continue using this class is because it's already used almost everywhere in Magento, where we have JSON encode, JSON decode logic. So it would be just consistent.
I wouldn't just consider
confusion.
Try catch is easier, but for example, if the exception would be thrown and the third-party extension does not handle that exception, it will lead to the fatal error, so that this exception will become more evident. So it wouldn't be possible to like avoid it somehow. And it's much better to have the evident problem that some implicit.
Okay, so we still want this interface. We still want to use it in our code base, in Magento code base, and we want to promote other developers to use it, right? We don't want to enforce them to use it, or do we want to enforce them to use it? I don't think it makes sense to enforce.
I don't think that it makes sense to enforce, so I agree here with Vinay. So I'm not sure that we have to enforce third-party developers to use it in their code, but probably it should be used in Magento modules.
There's one more aspect, There's one more aspect I just wanted to mention, even though that is already taking more time than I expected, but that is why I don't use the serializer interface is because it's actually serialization format independent. And in my experience, the data is actually very valuable, and it's wonderful to use a non-PHP specific serialization format like JSON. And JSON is far from perfect, but it's still a widely known and implemented format. You know, many databases support it natively. You can use it easily from JavaScript, from Java, from any other language. So I like that it's explicitly JSON, right? So anytime, instead of using the serializer interface in my code, even if I wanted to use a Magento class, I would still use a JSON implementation rather than the serializer interface. And I know, Igor, you said that's a leaky abstraction, but I think hiding away the serialization format is something that doesn't work, because people will rely on the concrete format anyway. That just happens to be JSON right now. So I think it's better to make it explicit and allow people to basically open it up to work with the data with other tools and languages too. So personally, my suggestion would be to add the option argument to serialize. That would make it easy to use without a lot of understanding a lot of complexity. It's very straightforward to understand. The error handling is in there. The anti-corruption layer against JSON decode bugs in PHP is there. And then, for example, the serializer interface could be deprecated and JSON could be promoted instead. Yeah, but that's a different topic. That's a completely different topic.
Yeah, that's completely different topic.
Would be my main thing.
I agree with that, and we actually recommend to depend on specific implementation, JSON or serialize. We don't recommend to depend on the interface, and we we should remove this interface and just have implementations. I agree with you.
Let's discuss. Does anybody agree that we now need an extension point like a serialization at all? Because currently we have the serializer interface. So that currently what I propose is to deprecate and eventually to remove this interface at all and have just JSON encoder.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I am disagree with it.
Can we discuss? I want to understand why, Vinay. So you said that you want to understand the data, but this interface, even implementation, the class JSON hides from you that it's the data. You don't receive JSON from it, right? So what's the point of knowing that it's JSON?
The point is that it's JSON. It will return a string that is JSON. It's called JSON. So that the format is JSON, it's part of the name. I don't think it's hidden.
Okay.
We talk about serializer interface, not about implementation of interface.
I'm talking about the JSON. Well, at the moment, if anybody uses serializer interface, he will get JSON, and that's written to the database, and that's whatever people use serializer interface for. And I've seen people use the serializer interface because people are supposed to serializer interface, and they rely on that as JSON. So they produce values that later are decoded with JSON decode function in PHP. So changing the implementation of serializer interface to a different format, I think, would be would introduce a lot of problems. And instead, I am happy to hear that the concrete implementation is already being promoted to be used. That sounds great. I think there's value in there for people using it, and it's easier to use anyway. And it's a stable format, so it won't change a lot. So I think there's no downside in using a concrete implementation versus instead of an interface there. So just using class JSON.
Doesn't mean that you have to delete serializer interface.
It can stay around, but
for some
just
instances.
promoting JSON and just using JSON where directly, it's a straightforward, simple solution to a problem that's valid, I believe. So okay, that's pretty much all the input I have on this. I don't know. Does that answer your question, Anton? I'm not sure. Sorry, might have gotten sidetracked.
Yeah. Do we have a lot of questions to discuss today?
We have some more questions. I think we kind of okay with continue using JSON wrapper around PHP function, and we want to fix the problem of not able to pass all of the options by adding optional arguments.
Okay,
so actually that's a question, because we can add the arguments, but if we will decide, so the particular implementation could be different, and actually it depends on the resolution regarding whether we are deprecating the serializer interface or not. Because if we are deprecating, why to keep this as an optional argument, for example? Because currently, if we will decide to support the serializer interface, we will have the one particular class, which in fact implements two contracts, like serializer interface and the JSON decode interface. And it would be done on the level of one function, because in case of the serializer, it would be function with one parameter. In case of the JSON decode, it would be the same function, but with two additional optional parameters. Because this is not really semantically.
I think that we cannot do serializer interface because it's not about JSON, and from this point of view, don't make sense to add any optional parameter to it. So if you need JSON encoding and decoding, it's absolutely not about serializing. It's about JSON encoding and decoding. It's absolutely two different things to do.
That's the question which Vinay raised. So whether we have any other, whether we have business cases where we don't really depend on the format of the data which is serialized. So the real serializer.
I think we do.
Like caching, for instance, but it's better. It's better not to have this interface because it's confusing.
No, it's not confusing. Confusing is that people think that if it default implementation of serializer is JSON, that means that it's always be JSON. This is confusing, but not serializer interface. So probably not interface, probably in people that think
Let's
that
replace people.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
if what does it mean if we have a preference for interface and allow our framework allow you to change this preference? It's probably not good design, because if you change the preference, everything breaks.
But
Yeah,
actually not. Actually
that's
not. If it's not new implementation that, for example, I built on top of Magento framework my new framework and change preference serializer for PHP serialization, my framework will work okay, absolutely.
Yeah, framework will work okay, but Magento application would not work okay, and
Actually, if it's new installation, Magento application will work also okay.
Yes, but let's just focus on what we trying to solve. So, if my understanding, what valid point from Andrei was that actually the abstraction that this JSON class serializer is proposing, it's not the serialization abstraction, it's encoding decoding abstraction. So ideally, if you have serializer that uses JSON, we would have JSON encoder class and decoder that would hide the complexity of error handling, something like that, if I understood correctly what Andrei was talking about.
I just consider that serialization is not correct word in this case. It should be marshalling. So like a more general type of the encoding. Because we always consider like about serialization like it's PHP serialization, but it's what it actually here it's marshalling.
Okay, so it sounds like we don't have. So there are still some things that we need to consider in it. I mean, we can. So we have a proposal that has 2 options, but we should add third option. Sounds like that was
4 options there.
Oh, are all options covered there? That
Yes.
we discussed?
Maybe not all of that were discussed, but there are 4 options available. So first of all, the question I would like to get.
Can you please share your screen? I believe all these options are mentioned in the proposal.
Yes, sure, I can. So my question is about extension developers. Do we enforce extension developers to use some abstraction layer or no? This is like the most important thing, and then we can decide what to do with internal framework and internal recommendations.
I don't think we should enforce it, but definitely we should recommend it. Right? So we offer some solution for them.
Okay, then after this answer, we can move forward to what we want to recommend.
Do we have agreement that we don't force people to use this interface, but we need a mechanism where they can be notified that there is a solution, that there is a problem with this function. We offer the solution for that problem. You can use that. Do we have agreement?
You just announced this agreement.
Yeah, we cannot force people to use wrong things. We cannot only recommend.
Use what? People what?
We cannot force people to use wrong things. We can only recommend to use proper.
Yeah, okay. So let's recommend to use better thing, right?
Yep.
And everybody has agreement, no objections to that? So what does it mean, recommend versus enforce? It means that if an extension is submitted with, or if in our code sniff, our code sniff should notify it, but that should be we need a mechanism in our code sniff that will tell you that there is a suggestion, but it will not fail your build or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Right? Okay, so.
Okay, and what we need to decide later, what we will recommend.
Okay,
what exactly, what kind of implementation we would recommend to use? Will introduce new encoder interface or improve existing one?
Okay, so let us take a look better. At least me, I would like to take a better look at this options. Let's discuss it. Let's finalize it next week.
Okay.
Yeah,
sounds good.
Can I ask Olga to add a link to this documenter on Zend JSON class and our JSON helper that we use in a view part of our system to encode JSON, because it have additional functionality on top of JSON encode and add translation to the JSON.
Great. So let's review it offline and comment. Try to make decision in the proposal by the next meeting. So the next topic is from Sergey Vashenko about replacing array interface with option source interface. Do you want to share your screen, Sergey?
Yeah. Hello, folks.
Hola.
So that's a public pull request that has a proposition to eliminate array interface. Basically, array interface is an empty interface that extends option source interface, and option source interface includes one public function to option array. So array interface looks to be unnecessary, and first it was marked as deprecated a few patch releases ago by the same contributor, and now we actually have a proposal to replace all the usages of array interface with the parent option source interface. The question is, what do you think about it, and which version of which release of Magento can include such changes?
But it's already deprecated, correct?
Yeah, it was deprecated 2 patch releases ago.
Into the 3.1.
Yeah, as far as I remember.
So it can't be eliminated earlier than since Magento 2.4.
Yeah, however, we are not going to eliminate the interface now. We are going to just replace the usages of interface with the parent interface.
Doesn't look like a big change, but I would personally suggest to deliver it in the minor release. Because if you check type of these implementations or interfaces for some reason, it would not work as before. It's unlikely that someone does it, but just to be safe.
Agree with Igor. Changing parents needs to be a major level change, which means it can only go into a minor release.
Okay, then if there are no objections, I think we'll schedule delivery of this pull request to 2.4, and we'll replace the existing usages, and we'll also remove an array interface completely from Magento. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, thanks.
And by the way, we already have improvement to our backward compatibility policy on this topic pending review.
Okay. So the next item is from Alex Tolerosh about optional argument.
So we already had some discussion internally whether we consider change in constructor by adding optional parameter as patch change or minor change. But we didn't come to conclusion, and right now we are in the process of delivering patch releases, and we have a lot of questions from development teams. whether adding optional parameter to API classes is allowed or cannot be done in patch release. The proposal initially was to allow this change in patch release, basically treat all optional constructor arguments as patch except for layer supertypes, like several classes like abstract extensible model, abstract blocks. There is a list of up to 10 classes, I believe, for which we propose to treat this as minor, and for everything else to treat it as patch. However, we probably split 50-50 internally, and we don't have vision.
So the biggest issue with applying this rule for all classes marked with an API PHP annotation is that currently all the blocks and the view models supposed to be APIs. So that actually means that we like Magento developers are not able to introduce any dependency to blocks or view models, because this this change will lead to minor changes to the class.
And by the way, for now, the rule is that we cannot introduce it anywhere. So the proposal was to relax agreement and say that everywhere except for several classes, it will be treated as patch.
What is about some abstract model or something like that?
Yeah, so as I say, like
that's layer supertype.
Yeah, so there is a list of up to 10 classes for which we say the change will be minor. So we cannot change layer supertype because we basically, the thinking behind this is very simple. If we expect people to extend from specific classes, then we don't allow changing constructors of those classes. If we do not expect people to take inherit from classes, and that's relevant for most of classes we have, then we should allow to change this constructor. Looks like unfortunately we don't have many community people left. It would be nice to hear from them as well.
Okay, so yeah, so please then announce us on App Design chat and get with some opinions from there.
The thing is that you may want to figure class with a particular type of dependency.
What you could mean?
Like if you add optional dependency to a class, you may want to supply different implementations that substitute.
Yeah, so actually that's the main issue. Why we want to prevent it, because we are breaking the extensibility. Because if the child class is not accepting this parameter via the constructor, it's not possible for extension developers to tune the implementation of the inbound parameter to the constructor.
Not even that. Even if the class doesn't have child classes, you may write an extension that would substitute a dependency in this class that we just added in the patch release. But because we say that this is a patch change, your extension would depend on minor version of this module, and you would expect it to be compatible with the previous versions of these modules. But it will actually would not be able, like this option was added in the patch release. That's makes sense.
So we are losing possibility of configuration and optimization of the class.
Yeah. One possibility to fix it is that in our get argument of object manager provide context. So if you provide context like current class, you can get proper dependency in this case.
But problem is with context is similar. If you modify context, you will have to add public method. And
no, you don't. You get method to obtain dependency from object manager. So what's the problem? We already get the dependencies from object manager, but if you need to specify different dependency for a particular class, you cannot do it. Yep, and this is problem. But if you add a current class like context for get method, object manager can resolve the proper dependency for your class.
I see. I see what you're saying. So you're talking about the case when we don't add dependency in the constructor, but pass some context instead.
Context in object manager that resolve in actually if a child class don't get argument and pass it in parent, we get null in argument and use object manager to get the dependency. Yep. And in this case, this dependency can be configured over DI for a particular class.
It can be, but it still looks like a minor change.
That's correct, but what it means that we need to change the object manager, signature of the method get for the object manager, which is supposed to be called in the child class and which should accept the self.
Actually, you can do it in backward compatible way because get. Okay, no, we cannot. It's only if I create.
We can introduce a new class. Not that hard. That will accept both the class name and an argument name to which to resolve dependence.
So yeah, what Henry proposed makes sense if we implemented this from the scratch, but taking into account that we already have quite a lot of code with object manager in the child constructor, so we are not able to do that because that will introduce backward incompatible change.
What are the reasons to add optional dependency instead of just creating this dependency via object manager inside the class without adding it to constructor? So one reason is that we would not be able to change, supply different dependency, but we will not have issue with someone trying to depend on this dependency in the minor, trying to depend on this this dependency exists and relying on minor version of the extension. So to me, it feels like it's better to create these dependencies in the constructor without modifying constructors in the patch releases and move these dependencies to constructors in the minor releases.
I believe the main issue is you cannot write unit tests.
You can. There is a workaround, but you probably don't want to write a unit test for this class. There is probably 90% chance that you wouldn't want to write a unit test for that class.
Why? Okay, it's a separate discussion about unit testing. Let's skip it.
So, are there any other opinions? What should we do? Should we vote again or write down a list of pros and cons for each solution to make it more visible?
So I'm writing message in Untitled Chapter right now, maybe to get something from community.
And make a poll, just to make people possibility to vote for one of the other solutions.
Could you show this? Should we review this message to make sure that it summarizes everything we discussed? All of the concerns. I don't know if it makes sense.
Okay, so what concerns we have? All the concerns we have is relaxing agreement.
Yeah, what concerns we have is relaxing agreement that extensions that depends on minor version of the module will break.
It will not break.
It will not break, yeah. So we limit possibility of customization of the child class, but that's not exactly break.
It would break if you decide to supply different dependency. If you provide configuration to supply different dependencies, this extension does not work for previous patch release.
It's not a break. This is a lack of extensibility. So you can't extend it with another version of the dependency, but it's not a breaking.
Yeah, actually, breaking is not to add optional parameter, but configure it in DI over argument.
But
so we need to not allow in patch release configure arguments, optional arguments over DI, because it is breaking change.
But we cannot disallow this because how would you disallow this? By default, it's allowed. It should be only disallowed to dependencies that added in the patch releases. It becomes a little bit confusing. So my understanding is that we want to add we want to modify constructors over just creating dependencies using Object Manager inside the constructor in a hidden way, because if dependency in the constructor, you can customize it. So this is argument against not modifying constructors. But in case of API classes, to me, it looks better to just create hidden dependency inside the class in the patch releases and move these dependencies to the constructor in the minor releases, because we can do what we need to do. We can add our dependency. We would not allow in the patch releases to customize this dependency. There would be no backwards incompatible changes or hidden bugs that we can cause to extensions.
Yeah, technically yes, but on practice we never do it because there's no team to do it in next releases.
I guess I had the same problem right now that we don't do this new arguments not optional in the next minor releases. So I agree with Andres, we are going to have more legacy with every minor release if you will add all the dependency as a hidden one.
Probably we already had so Max also probably a year ago wrote the static analyzer, which is supposed to find all this optional, which in fact are not optional parameters, and during the minor release, change the optional to mandatory arguments to constructor and fix this kind of legacy technical debt which we got during the minor release, and updated all the minor release.
So it sounds like we can create a tool that would move these dependencies from hidden to
Yeah, so, we can, but maybe in this case we need to deliver these changes in the same time, this new test and this new rule. Because if you just release these rules, then it can be verified on the manual way. And we don't have some dedicated team who is going to lead this process, so...
We have trade-off backwards compatibility over prioritizing work. So let's get feedback from the community and then discuss it again. The next item on the agenda is from Peter, gaps in SVC coverage. Peter, do you want to describe?
Yeah. So there are a number of gaps in our semantic versioning tool for things that should be flagged as backwards incompatible. we'll just go down the list. The first one is.
Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, just a second. No, that's not what I wanted. Okay. Okay, so here's what we're looking at. The missing analysis for backwards incompatible changes. So the first one, it has to deal with type declarations and annotations. So these are things like doc block comments that have the @param and @returns annotations. We use those in our code base to declare typing, but they are not checked by the SVC tool. The SVC tool only checks for inline type declarations. So since we use those annotations to declare the types, or that is declaring to any extenders of those methods that those are the types we're going to use for the contract, so they should be considered for backwards incompatibility. The second point under type declarations is that we don't check for typing of class parameters that are extensible, so anything that's public or protected. That's not supported inline by PHP until PHP 7.4 comes out, but we still use those, or the @var annotation to declare those typings. So the question is, should we check those annotations for type compatibility the same as we do for methods, or should we wait until PHP enforces it with their inline? Anyone have any thoughts?
Plus, it makes sense to track it.
Okay.
It's kind of problematic for legacy code, but we definitely can try to do that for new code.
But what is about adding or removing some types that can be reason of some backwards incompatible changes? So we've already faced this problem when someone adds some strict type declaration for parameters in the API classes, and then it breaks someone on community because we don't have this check.
Correct. So basically, for API folder, it should be. So is this about annotation for parameters, correct? Because there was one for variables as well.
Yeah, there are 2 points here. The first one's for method annotations, so parameters and return types. And the second one is for...
Method annotations, it definitely makes sense to track it in APIs, and literally in API directory of every module. And for parameters, I'm not sure, because it may be too strict if you try to introduce it before PHP 7.4.
I don't understand why that would be too strict. We already have rules around adding and removing class properties. So why shouldn't we also consider class properties for typing?
I believe the issue could be that typing currently is not accurate in many cases, because it's not checked by PHP, and I'm pretty sure that there will be a lot of issues. Like, unless we go and fix issues in existing code base, might be problematic. And for API classes, we know for sure that it's accurate because we have our web API based on that, and if there are any issues, our web API will be broken already.
Okay. Well, I would say that we should fix those incorrect annotations, but if we want to wait on adding those rules until we do, that also makes sense to me.
Maybe we should add. So we have some other items in this improving semantic version to backlog.
Yeah.
I would propose to add it to the backlog and then just prioritize it. I think it's a good proposal. proposal, but there might be some other items that have higher priority. But we need to have this list and prioritize it.
Sure. I agree with that. I just wanted to get the proposal through discussion before filling out all the tickets. The type declaration annotations already has a ticket, but the rest of them don't. Okay, so the next gap in coverage are traits. We have traits that are marked as being part of our API, but the semantic version checker doesn't consider traits at all. We only look at classes and interfaces. So since traits are something that is extensible, we need to consider them for backwards incompatibility. And they should be treated the same as classes, except we need to treat private functions and private properties of traits as protected in classes, because anything that uses a trait has access to anything that's marked as private inside it.
Did you mention that some traits have API annotation?
Yes, there's an example in the proposal document I have here. I'll pull that up. So this is one that we use in the payment module that is marked with the API annotation. So it's already marked as being part of our API, but the tool doesn't consider it for versioning rules.
Okay, makes sense.
Next one is visibility changes. This should be a quick one, and that's just that we need to treat visibility changes as the same as we do for adding or removing methods, because it changes their accessibility. So if we move a method to be more visible, that needs to be treated as an add, and less visible needs to be treated as a remove. So minor and major level respectively.
Mm-hmm.
The last one is class inheritance. So this is something that we don't check at all in the versioning tool that has some major impacts. So the first one is just an oversight. It's a note on here that when we override a parent method, it needs to be treated as a changed method and not an added method, because that method was already existing or already accessible in the class beforehand. So that one's just basically a bug. But the rest of these are actually missing implementation. So the second point here is if you change the parents of an API class, so if you change which interface it implements or which class it extends or which traits it uses, this needs to be a major level change because it affects type compatibility and even what members exist on it, like methods or properties or what have you. So we need to look at that. If we add a parent to something that didn't previously have a parent, that's even if the parent that we add, like if we're making a class extend a new abstract class, even if that abstract class isn't marked as API, if the class that extends it is, then we need to treat everything, or we need to treat it as if everything that was part of that abstract class was added to the API class.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, for removing a parent, we remove something and it affects type compatibility, and that needs to be treated as the same as removing everything that was part of that parent. And the last part of it is that we need to check if the parents of an API class have changes inside them. So if an abstract class that's not marked as API has changes to a method or removes a method, we need to treat that as a change for any API classes that extend that abstract class.
Let's say it again.
So if we have an API class that extends a non-API abstract class, we still need to look at that abstract class for any
Actually-
backward compatible changes because it affects what's in the API class.
According to our standard, all the abstract classes must be marked as an API.
That's true, but we have classes that extend regular classes. It's not abstract classes, just an example for clarification here, but any class can be extended unless it's marked as final. So really, we just need to look at the parents of API classes for changes.
Igor, could you please repeat your statement about abstract classes?
Yeah. So if we
I'm
have
sorry.
an API class that extends a non-API abstract class, the members of that abstract class are also members of the API class. So if those members change, then the API changes and we need to consider them for backwards incompatibility.
No, I mean what Igor said about abstract classes.
Oh.
You said that abstract classes must not be marked as public API, correct?
All the abstract classes must be marked as an API.
But we have statement in the technical guidelines that says abstract classes must not be marked as public API.
Can you point this out? Because
Sure, I will send.
Because I'm
Nope, not this page. Nope. Nope. I remember reading the same thing, and I'm just trying to find where that is.
I found. It's 2.8.
2.8?
I just sent a link to the chat.
Oh, gotcha. Yep, we have that rule right here. Abstract classes must not be marked as public API.
I think the idea of using interfaces stands behind this.
I think we need to clarify it, probably related to interfaces. I agree. Currently, we have a lot of abstract classes that needs to be marked with API notation, but we ideally we should not have these abstract classes. We just need to clarify this statement. Okay, do you want to continue, Peter?
That was my last point, I believe.
I think
the rest of this document already existed. So I just added this section about the missing analysis.
Okay, I think it does make sense. Did you create this? Is this a new proposal or update to existing proposal?
It's an update to an existing proposal from Alex.
Alex, okay. I think it all makes sense. It might be good to also have Alex review this proposal. But
Alex already has.
Yeah, he has. Did he approve it?
Yes.
Okay, then we can just accept it.
I have one question about semantic version checker.
Sure.
Right now, it's a private tool and it's not publicly available. Is there any discussions around making it public?
I believe that just came up in the architects channel at the beginning of this meeting. Igor asked about it.
Probably makes sense to make it public so developers can check if their extensions backwards compatible using the same tool. So, do you agree?
Yeah.
So we will. I can follow up. How can we? What exactly needs to? What would be the process to make it public? So we have more items. So we have one item from Irina. Irina is not here.
I believe all those items should be moved to the next
meeting. One item is from Vlad Veselo, but I don't see
he's not on
him
the call.
So yeah, looks like this is it. Then, right. Thank you for your time. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you guys.